Hello, everyone, and welcome to our hybrid gathering in celebration of Tina Campt's recent book, A Black Gaze. My name is Victoria Collis-Buthelezi, and I have the pleasure of hosting this evening here in Johannesburg, afternoon for Tina on the US East Coast, and morning, evening, night, elsewhere on the globe. As the director of the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg, I see today's gathering as the first of many collaborations that bring together the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class, the Forge, the Commune, New Frame, the Sojourner Project, as a Black Studies Mobile Academy, and the Practicing Refusal Collective, to think from, through, in, with, alongside Blackness. I thank my colleagues from our various spaces for the work that they have put into making this happen. I also want to thank those of you who have chosen to sit with us here in person and tune in via live stream, for joining our community at this time. It seems so much more than serendipity or chance that a Black gaze is the occasion which brings us together in person, in spirit, and virtually. Now, what we are doing tonight speaks to our shared commitments to conversation, engagement, action, and thought about the global conditions and practices of Blackness. It conjures our locatedness in our own spaces and times, and the ways in which they interlock with each other's. As Tina Campt explains in the book's prelude, a Black gaze should be read as a provocation to reckon with the paradox of being Black in the 21st century, and the new forms of Black sociality that come with this. Digital image making and new weather patterns, increased Black corporate economic power alongside new heightened Black precarity and vulnerability, digital community making and archiving, and most recently, the forced slowdown of time due to the pandemic. The book asks us, what does the hustle for full freedom, radical Black joy look like at this conjuncture? What does it sound like? How does it move? How do we witness it? Thus, we begin with a reading from the book by Tina and a sonic intervention from vinyl selector Zara Julius. After Tina's reading and Zara's sonics, we'll then move into our discussion of the book with presentations from Nomusa Makhubu and Danielle Bowler. For those of us here at the Forge, we'll take questions for Tina and the wider panel after those presentations. For folks joining us via the live stream, please post your questions there, and one of my colleagues will collect them, and I will read them out on your behalf. Thereafter, we'll end with two screenings that feature in the book by author Jafa and Simone Leigh. Sorry, let me just clarify. The Simone Leigh screening will appear both live and via the live stream. The Arthur Jaffa screening will appear in person, but we have set up access for those who are viewing via live stream through the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, Classes website. So we'll provide those details as it becomes necessary. Now let me introduce Tina and Zara. Tina Campt is a Black feminist theorist of visual culture and contemporary art. She is the Owen F. Walker Professor of Humanities and Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. She's the founding convener of the Practicing Refusal Collective and leads the Black Visualities Initiative at the Kogut Institute for Humanities at Brown University. She also sits on the board of the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. One of the founding researchers in Black European studies, Campt's early work theorized gender, racial, and diasporic formation in Black communities in Europe and Southern Africa, focusing on the role of vernacular photography in processes of historical interpretation. Her books include Other Germans, Black Germans and the Politics of Race, Gender and Memory in the Third Reich, Image Matters, Archive Photography and the African Diaspora in Europe, and Listening to Images. Her latest book, A Black Gaze, engages our contemporary moment of visualizing Blackness through a series of encounters with art and artists that challenge readers to engage in embodied practices of witnessing that center race and gender as crucial to these experiences. Zara Julius is a social practice artist, cultural researcher, and vinyl selector. She has an honors in social anthropology and an MFA in fine art. Her work is concerned with the relationship between aesthetics, frequency, and rapture across the African continent and the African diaspora in the global South. Through sound, video, performance, and object-based installation, her practice involves the collection, selection, creation, and performance of archives, both real and imagined. Join me in welcoming Tina Campt and Zara Julius.
I am thrilled to be able to present to you a short part of the new book, A Black Gaze. I am thrilled about the conversation, about the sonic intervention that is going to follow. And what I'm going to be reading is a section from a verse. The book is divided up into verses rather than chapters. And it's a verse that I find incredibly appropriate for this moment because it is a verse that names one of the primary things that has sustained me, and I'm sure has sustained many of you through this horrible, horrible period. It is a verse that is called Sounding a Black Feminist Chorus. And I'm going to ask our fabulous tech folks to bring up the first slide. Loophole of retreat. The dark enclosure of an attic space where she plots and plans. She dreams of possibility from within impossible strictures of confinement. Her escape is imminent as her imagination is boundless. Her enclosure is an incubator for a practice of refusal and a roadmap to freedom. These words describe the plight of an enslaved girl who dreamed into life practices of self-care and intellectual fortitude, executed cunning acts of subversion, and exercised fugitive forms of love and connection that were chronicled by Harriet Jacobs in her 1861 account, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where she described her struggle to escape captivity and the 7 years she spent hiding in the attic crawl space of her grandmother's home. A loophole is a way out, an escape route, or a means of extricating oneself from a seemingly impossible situation. A retreat is a place of sanctuary, seclusion, and refuge, or a pathway to elude or escape from an enemy. Harriet Jacobs' loophole of retreat was all of these at once, both a safe harbor and an escape route from a seemingly unwinnable struggle. These registers of fugitive creativity and possibility are referenced by Simone Leigh in her 2019 exhibition, Loophole of Retreat. Continuing Jacobs' legacy of enacting furtive forms of freedom from within the confines of enclosure, Leigh revalues forms of Black women's labor, too often rendered invisible. The sound, sights, and touch of my childhood distracted and inundated me as I listened in the corner of a chamber constructed of latticed concrete blocks, a sound installation Simone Leigh dubbed Loophole of Retreat 1. I responded to the need to dwell in the space by sliding down a wall and taking up my habitual posture of sitting cross-legged on the floor. This time, my seat was on a concrete floor at the base of a wide bronze cylinder, elevating a crown of twisted cornrows atop a conical chestnut-glazed ceramic form. My vantage point in the enclosure placed me at the feet of a steady stream of visitors that I watched mill in and out in silent consternation, seemingly perplexed by the meaning of what they found within its four walls. Yet they quickly disappeared from my view as I found myself swept up in the sounds that suffused the space. Barely decipherable voices mingled with ambient refrains and samples of horn riffs, drums, hums, and freestyled solos. A percussive rattle jostled with an improvised melody, ending with a chuckle and a giggle. It blended seamlessly into the muffled cry of a baby and a repeated refrain, "I love you," that looped equally seamlessly into a reprise of the clap slap song play of a Black girl assembly transposed against a background of a late 70s urban beat. Sharing the name of its exhibition's title, the installation is a sonic instantiation of a loophole of retreat. The soundscape created for the installation by Leigh in collaboration with musician and poet Moore Mother layers these quotidian sounds over musical samples and more recent audio from contemporary prison protests. Heard within the latticed concrete walls, this eerie soundscape reverberates in conversation with the ceramic head of coiled tendrils to create a zone of what Leigh calls sonic protection. It is an installation designed to render what Black women's labor of protection might have sounded like in one particular year, 1978. An unremarkable year for some, 1978 was the year that Debbie Sims Africa gave birth to her second child at the age of 22 while incarcerated at the Cambridge Springs Women's Prison in Erie, Pennsylvania. She was charged and later convicted along with 8 other members of the Black liberation group MOVE in the aftermath of a police siege of their headquarters and communal residence in Philadelphia for the death of an officer during their military-style incursion. Although the officer was killed by a single bullet, all 9 were convicted of collective responsibility for his death. Debbie Africa was 8 months pregnant when she was arrested and eventually served 40 years in prison before being granted parole in 2018. 5 weeks after her arrest, she secretly gave birth to her son David in her cell. Loophole of Retreat 1 pays tribute to the labor of one woman's extraordinary effort to spend 3 uninterrupted days bonding with her son before being separated from him by prison authorities. It pays tribute as well to the efforts of her incarcerated sisters who worked to conceal his birth and create a protective space of refuge and sanctuary for mother and child. It honors their collective effort by recreating a space of sonic protection akin to that which these women created for Debbie and her son when they alternatively stood vigil outside her cell and sang, coughed, or created other forms of sonic interference to shield her child from detection. It was through sound that they constructed a collective wall of protection and a 3-day loophole of retreat for mother and child. It was their chorus of Black women's insurgency that sounds with haunting urgency in the perforated enclosure of Loophole of Retreat 1. 3 towering figures stand proudly in a commanding triangle. One faces the figure opposite, seemingly transfixed by her presence. She does not return the gaze, but she does not look away. Smooth Black surfaces stand in for what should be the figure's eyes, but it is an absence that in no way signals a lack of sight. They hold each other's gazes. They hold each other's presence. They rest and hold each other in what becomes an almost sacred space of quiet intensity. A flawlessly formed afro-adorned head rests on a beautiful, bare torso. It sits atop wide ebony hips that extend into the handle of a vessel. Another equally flawless afro-adorned head rests not on a torso, but finds its anchor instead on the fullness of a grass skirt. But it is a skirt that sheathes her only partially. What is left uncovered is a structure that expands beneath her. Resting alongside her and rendering her in a sphinx-like repose, it is not a body that radiates outward from her billowing raffia skirt. Rather, it is a corrugated accordion-like structure resembling a silo. Like a silo, she is both a repository and a vessel. She is a shelter. The third figure sharing the space is an equally commanding presence whose multi-tiered straw skirt, supports a stovepipe at its apex that mimics a torso. Similar to her sphinx-like sister, her figure is both a persona and a domicile. While the gazes of Leigh's monumental Black figures are obscured, they penetrate and they pervade nonetheless. The absence of eyes that should serve as the sources, origins, or conduits of these looks intensifies our search for contact and connection. Their absence amplifies a look that is there but not there. It is a look that seeks us out even in its erasure. United kindred in the gallery, the three figures create a sheltering space of care, providing refuge as a group that watches out and watches over. They are a trio who embrace without touching, speak without words or sound, and gaze without eyes with power and grace at one another and at us. Like their sibling installation, Panoptica, Jug, and Sentinel cohere as a chorus. In his review of the exhibition, Seth Rodney begins with a confession, quote, "I wouldn't normally expect an object that's meant to defy the inquisitive gaze to be as large as this." He is correct. They are monumental figures, ranging between 8 and 10 feet high. But why not expect their monumental stature? Isn't their scale part and parcel of their defiance as an overt response that rises to the challenge of a gaze that routinely seeks to probe, diminish, and overwhelm Black women? And while I agree with Rodney that these works do indeed, quote, defy the inquisitive gaze, and that the absence of eyes in these and multiple other sculptures in Leigh's broader oeuvre is significant, let's just say I think it's a little bit more complicated. Yes, Leigh's work denies a white and dominant gaze, but I believe we underestimate its power when we understand its impact as achieved either reactively or at the level of negation or reserve. Its purchase lies instead in the power of opacity, which produces its own form of scrutiny and in turn its own distinctive gaze. For as Rodney rightly emphasizes, Leigh's awe-inspiring formation, the triumvirate of Panoptica, Jug, and Sentinel that she brings into silent conversations with the sonic protections ushered forth by Loophole of Retreat 1, demand complex forms of labor. The opacity of these works most certainly requires us to check our desire for reciprocal recognition and in turn to sit uncomfortably with the impulse to transform that discomfort into a form of reflection that is potentially transformative. Yet I would contend that this is not a result of the elusiveness or incalculability of these figures. It is not their ability to silence their interlocutors. Though, as I have written before and will reiterate in any time I can, Black women's refusal to use words to render the complexity of our interiority is, more often than not, taken as an affront. It is rather our capacity to actively create our own gaze, a Black gaze, that demands active forms of engagement rather than passive acts of watching or consumption, that requires the work of witnessing from its viewer. It is the work of enduring discomfort and facing it head on. The gaze that ricochets between Panoptica, Jug, and Sentinel is a Black feminist formation Leigh constructs by configuring them as a group formation, as a female chorus, in dialogue without words, in concert without instruments, in song without notes, gazing without eyes and speaking without voices. Together they create not the hush of silence, but a quiet, disruptive chorus of subversive Black feminist noise. She bobs and swings, dips and sways, hops and shuffles. Stoic at first, a smile washes over her face, blossoms briefly into a grin, then settles into a restful look of satisfaction. In the opening sequence of Simone Leigh's 2018 film, Untitled MASH, her gaze fixes us with a steady, unwavering focus. With a tambourine in her hand and cymbals affixed on appendages initially out of view, the hop, slap, and wordless shimmer of a joyous Black woman in military fatigues is slowly overtaken by the swell of a hand-pumped organ. The film transitions to a solo performance in a cavernous space through the image of a Black woman rinsing her glistening face. Our gaze shifts to a Black woman clothed in white garments of medical care, preparing for a procedure in the vast warehouse. She inserts tiny needles with precision into the smooth skin of her ebony patient. Her methodical digital labor of painlessly affixing these delicate tools of healing is hailed by a triumphant musical chorus. To be young, gifted, and Black, zealously delivered through a curtain of chestnut curls and a glowing smile. I think we should be shifting to the next one. There we go, great. Cut to a mother cradling her wiggling infant in one arm while reading aloud from a litany of Black manifestos in French. Surrounded by bodies in fatigues, at first seated upright but later prone, a Black woman in an anatomically correct bodysuit lays hands on each person. Cut again to a sweet soprano serenading a patient in army surgery with the gospel hymn, Precious Lord. She is flanked by two fellow caregivers in white, while in the background a figure leaps intermittently above a surgical screen. Untitled MASH tells the story of the United Order of Tents, an organization founded by Black nurses in 1840 to tend to wounded captives fleeing enslavement. Following emancipation, they formed a secret society to provide life insurance for their members to ensure that each would have the dignity of a Christian burial. Lee's film is a symbolic depiction of the labor of care provided by these women in their battle against enslavement, transported from the US South and reimagined as a group of nurses on a fictional battlefront in the Korean War. Although dressed in military khakis or uniforms of a medical battalion, the women depicted in Untitled MASH are neither combatants nor belligerents, nor are they engaged in the violent overthrow of a government or a regime. But the work they do is equally insurgent. It challenges the status quo of leaving their kindred to fend for themselves. These women sing to soothe, prick to heal, lay hands on to calm. They make music and speak manifestos. Configured in circles, triangles, or orderly rows, they assemble in multiples and speak in the voice of collective action. Like the towering chorus of Panoptica, Jug, and Sentinel, who offer a silent commentary on the passing in and on those passing in and out of the gallery, like the ambient yet insurgent sonic montage of Loophole of Retreat that perplexed so many visitors in the latticed enclosure, Untitled MASH also assembles a chorus, a Black feminist chorus of caregivers, as fearsome as any army of men. The rebellious forms of care and the revolutionary practices of mutuality modeled by the United Order of Tents in the late 19th century and practiced later by the incarcerated women who protected Debbie Africa in Cambridge Springs are powerful choral enactments of Black feminist insurgency. Thank you.
That
Thank you for grounding us in sound, Zara, for a book that is as much about what we see when we look at Black visuality as what we hear. I am honored to introduce the other two Black feminists sitting with me. Nomusa Makhubu is an associate professor in art history and deputy dean of transformation in humanities at the University of Cape Town. She was the recipient of the Absa L'Atelier Gerard Sekoto Award in 2006 and the Prix du Studio National des Arts Contemporains, Le Fresnoy, in 2014. She received the American Council of Learned Societies, ACLS, African Humanities Program Fellowship Award and was an African Studies Association Presidential Fellow in 2016. In 2017, she was also a UCT Harvard Mandela Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Recognizing the need for mentorship and collaborative practice in socially responsive arts, Nomusa founded the Creative Knowledge Resources Project. She co-edited a third text special issue, The Art of Change, in 2013, with Nkule Mabaso, and with Nkule Mabaso co-curated the international exhibition, Fantastic, in 2015, and The Stronger We Become in 2019 at the 58th Venice Biennale in Italy. Danielle Bowler is an editor, writer, and musician based in Johannesburg. Currently the culture editor at New Frame, she's the former managing editor of Elle magazine and has bylines in Mail and Guardian, Eyewitness News, Cosmopolitan, and Africa as a Country, among other publications. Danielle is also a frequent host and moderator of conversations, events, and panel discussions across art, feminism, intellectual and cultural work, and other forms of creative practice. Welcome.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic evening. I am thrilled to be here to share this moment and to reflect on Tina's book, and in such incredible company. Tina, I am overwhelmed by your humility and warmth, which has prepared us so well for walking in your words and finding ourselves in them, and finding the joy in the work that has to be done, to use Seth Rodney's words. In these past few days, I had been thinking specifically about labor as an integral part of the various experiences of the Black gaze. The notion that the Black gaze requires labor, that it's uneasy work, that it's hard work, has been on my mind for a while. Firstly, I have to say that I am really inspired by the courage in this book to tackle a concept, a practice, the gaze, that is so labored, so burdened, one that we've come to understand as a power structure that is defined through unidirectional and often sadistic pleasure and desire. It's no small feat to boldly change even the language that we use in reckoning with the violence that is so deeply entrenched in that relationship of the spectator and the spectacle, and as well as the alienating distance that sustains the colonial and imperial gaze. The work that has to be done is difficult. So on my way here from Cape Town, I was listening to, I don't know if anyone knows the band Incognito, of course, probably. everyone knows the group Incognito, but I was listening to Incognito and a song that I've loved for a very long time. It's titled A Labor of Love. And I got stuck on these lyrics, right? So the lyrics go something like this. I want to give you everything I got. Slow down, take it easy. All you've got to do is reach out for me. We can work and make it a labor of love. Right? So it's not that these lyrics necessarily, and I think, as I was listening to them, it's not that they were in any way attached to, the sort of short reflection on the book, but they kept bringing me back to this question of labor, right? And the labors in plural that are required, not only in looking at ourselves, Tina, as you aptly put it, it's not about looking at, right? But in experiencing and living with our images. I remember the first time I saw Arthur Jafa's work at the Venice Biennale. I moved around. I needed to sit with the work, and I wish I had actually sat on the floor to claim the piece of real estate. I didn't do that. I couldn't sit. I was unsettled. And I could not rest in some determinate meaning of the work. No words could have ever measured up to define what I felt watching. Having been trained in art history, I recognized my own shortcomings, the relentless and sometimes futile need to explain away, to be tasked with finding meaning and coherence. With AJ's work, there was no, this work is about, and I could not easily settle on what the work does. Here, with the Black gaze, the work requires skills that we're generally trained to suppress. It's not necessarily that we don't have the skills. It's skills that we learned from our parents, from our mothers. But it's skills that we're discouraged to use. So experiencing the curated footage, it was not necessarily the sense of wordlessness I feared most, but the overwhelming flurry of inchoate, discordant understandings of things I recognized, things I think I had seen, things I also hadn't seen, but could still feel the resonance, that I think feared me the most, right? It's that recognition. It's the thing. That's what strikes one as you're looking at the work. Oh, well, as you feeling and experiencing the world. It's the recognition and realization of how normalized the injustice is, such that our response to it can be so easily numb, even when our conscience moves us. And realizing that we live with the recurrence of that injustice. And that perhaps affective labor is not the labor of working through how one reacts to one horrific or even searingly beautiful incident or event. It's not work that starts here and ends there, but work that is lived in. Now, we have an exceptionally difficult relationship with labor. Our labor continues to be extracted, exploited, undervalued, abused. Labor can change how we shape ourselves. And I guess this is why this particular question of labor stuck in my mind for a while. How much more work, and what will it take from me? What will it need me to change of myself? What are the fruits of this labor? But as I was thinking about it, I realized that perhaps my questions may fit one or particular ways of understanding work, of understanding labor. What was being evoked in this book was a different kind of labor that's required of us. For one, it's not labor we are coerced to sell to anyone. And it is labor that is defined in the building of relationships. And it's our relationships with images, it's our relationship with those around us. And so, to go back to the very cheesy statement from the song, it's a labor of love. It's about reaching out, slowing down, collectivizing. The Black gaze implies something interesting that departs from how we understand the structure of the imperial gaze. It dislocates the individual position of the spectator. It annihilates the privilege of consumption. The Black gaze is necessarily collective affective labor and working to mend relationships with each other and how we have been represented to ourselves. That messy love relationship with images poses a predicament. On one hand, the industries of image making never loved us. The fact that our lives are mediated through images of ourselves reminds me of how Saidiya talked about the terrible spectacle of violence and the objectification of Black life. Or as Fred Moten put it, it was like being between looking and being looked at, between spectacle and spectatorship, enjoyment and being enjoyed, that lies and moves in the economy of hypervisibility. Saidiya also argued that it allows and demands an investigation of, there's a demand of the investigation of this hypervisibility, which opens us to the problematics of the everyday ritual, the stagedness of the violently and sometimes amelioratively quotidian, the essential drama of Black life. So, it's something that Arthur Jafa, in a conversation with Bell Hooks, also referred to as an ornamentation, of being in a position to mesmerize while being violated, and not being able to do anything about your violation. So how do we get out of the messy relationships and find a redemptive process, and find a kind of spiritual repatriation? Because, of course, that work is corporeal, it is bodily, right? And so when I was thinking about it, I kept thinking, what are the kinds of work that I have done and enjoyed doing? And I remember, when I was growing up, I used to do work with the family, with siblings, while dancing. How do we work while dancing? How do we find those currencies? How do we find those frequencies of working without feeling exploited, of working with joy, but working on the relationships? So in some ways, I guess it allows us to work with this economy of images in which past forms of representations are quoted, parodied, and reworked. But somehow, I think focusing and dwelling on those relationships will allow us to find the transfiguration, the transformation, and the conversion of what it means to labor in love and in each other. And yeah, with that, I will hand over to Dani.
Yeah, it is. Thank you very much for all of your offerings so far. I find myself so inspired and repeatedly thinking of the phrase, sounding a Black feminist chorus, which feels like it exemplifies what we're doing right now and this gathering. When I sat down to write, I don't want to say about a Black gaze, I want to say to write to the book in the way that Tina writes to art. I found myself thinking about critical optimism and radical possibility. And I found myself thinking about what Tina calls the grammar of the future real conditional, living within the as if we are free. As we create, live, experience, demand, struggle against, and struggle towards the future, but act as if it's already here. And in that spirit, I wanted to share parts of those reflections and parts of that writing too, which was defined by a profound joy, which I think is so rare and so lacking in work that struggles with, that contends with the tensions of the now. Tina Campt chooses words with care. In talking and writing, she opens them up, asking what they reveal, invite, conceal, imply, and make possible. She infuses a sensory sensibility into a Black gaze, a lyrical academic text that is alive, multidirectional, and clear, even while asking readers to work with the tensions inherent in the theory she builds over the book's 7 verses. She writes as she speaks in an imaginative, playful mode that is wrapped with joy, and as she says, filled with wonder. This is striking in an academic world so often laden with dense, near-opaque texts and vocabulary. In Campt's work, Jacques Lacan sits alongside text riffing on Arthur Jafa and Jay-Z's 444, illuminating personal anecdotes and a vernacular Black vocabulary, make the work conversational and attuned to the way art meets popular culture, the everyday, and readers. In her writing, she's propelled towards clarity, asking herself what she really wants to say, who her audience is, and who are the thinkers that she's thinking and working alongside. A Black gaze, as she says, is really theorizing while talking and listening. She creates concepts in which familiar words such as flow, slowness, or hum sit alongside haptic, fabulation, and the visual frequency of Black life. And all of these words appear new and sometimes with multiple definitions along the margins. This functions like a glossary and more. It's an invitation into her world and mind. She takes readers by the hand and walks us through the text, sometimes literally saying, "Let's go here," or "We now turn to this." In A Black Gaze, she's not alone, but is accompanied by the artists, art, collaborators, students, and the readers with whom she engages, creating a world that is built for all of us in just over 200 pages. A Black Gaze centrally explores how Black contemporary artists are creating new ways of visualizing Black struggle and transcendence, and in doing so, they offer a different trajectory for Black sociality, or ways of being and being together. This defies the terms of white supremacy, which locks Blackness into a singular way of being and being seen. Today, as she writes, we find ourselves in a peculiar paradox. We are inundated with images of precarious Black life, and simultaneously, we're experiencing the striking ascendancy of Black aesthetics in pop culture and in the art world. A Black Gaze locates itself, speaks from, and emerges within this paradox. The concept is not about Black ways of seeing or looking at Black people, or what she calls simply multiplying the representation of Black folks. It's a theory that she uses to explain how certain artists pose a radical question. What would it mean to see oneself through the complex positionality that is Blackness and work through its implications on and for oneself? In this art, Black life is not rendered in ways that allow it to be engaged at a safe distance or viewed at arm's length through a lens of pity or sympathy or concern. Rather, these renditions of Black life shift us, asking us to question how and from where we see. And she is aware that the use of the term "a Black gaze" is fraught, excavating these challenges in the work rather than simply ignoring them. But as I love, she asks us to be open, saying, "I never want to give anything up to power. That is my practice of refusal. I refuse the choices that limit my possibility to express the complexity of Black life." And that's really important. In refusal, for Campt, everything is both and not either or. A Black Gaze asks us to think about art that reckons with the dynamics of Black life's existence on the vast spectrums between pleasure and pain, life and death, freedom and oppression, joy and precarity, danger and dancing, all at once. It also asks us to reckon with any discomfort or difficulty that this causes. The strength of her work rests in an acute acknowledgement of the tensions, contradictions, and conflicts in this, all while thinking beyond its limits. Campt's cultural criticism takes pop culture seriously, and her work exemplifies the best of its kind. It asks us to think deeply about the everyday and the music, literature, and art that we habitually and constantly encounter. It gestures to and reflects on what they show us about who we are becoming, and who we want to be, speaking across our individual experiences. It asks us to understand how a song, a dance, a phrase, an artwork, or a music video can contain all the rich tensions of our world. Reading the work from South Africa, one wonders how the theory might travel, how we can apply it to the work of artists right here. Tina Campt invites this, describing the book as an invitation to reflection from different perspectives as we strive to find each other across Black experiences. Across our dynamic experiences, a Black gaze is the rejection of the status quo as livable by creating possibility in the face of negation. In this moving, productive spirit, Campt closes the book with the words, "Rebirth is necessary," loaned from the title of a Jen Nkiru work. And in Campt's world, as in ours, it is radically, beautifully, and always possible. Thank you.
This is an evening. It's an hour. Let me use the term, a conjunction time that I think I just want to treasure and return to, because what I think we've had when we were talking about doing this, one of the terms that we used for it is a kind of jam session. And if you have an opportunity to get this book, which I hope you do get it and read it, it's a term that Tina uses. So as we were thinking about it, we're thinking of it as study session, jam session, time together to work with the ideas, think through what's happening and how we have these kinds of conversations from different locations, and the extent to which it's a text that really deals with the very real understandings of what's happening and materialities of the 21st century and the digital, and how still images are becoming moving images. It just, I think we've had that, and it's just, I have to revel in the pleasure of it. So that was the it wasn't quite the hum, but that was the So I want to give you an opportunity, Tina, to engage with these responses to the book, and then maybe we can, continue, have a sort of round of engagements from the panel and open to our gathering here and on the live stream.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Victoria. And thank you, everyone. Oh, I'm doing it again. I'm only seeing me as a speaker. It is very difficult to speak to oneself. I don't know why, but I only see me. Okay, I'm going to put me away and just speak to you as if I could see you. That moment that you just paused was a moment of breath for me. And it was exactly the kind of breath that I really needed after listening to all of the wonderful responses and comments. I feel like one of the intentions of this book was to create some breathing room, some space to breathe together. And I need to acknowledge the fact that watching you in that space together just reminded me of how much we must cherish that, being able to be together and be in the same room. And the way in which you have it set up, I have to thank the tech folk, because I feel like I'm on the couch next to you. And that's a wonderful, wonderful feeling of being on the couch next to you, even if my image is looking over your shoulders. Okay, so that's a first reaction of just warmth and joy and connection. But there were so many things that both Danny and well, actually I want to just start with Danny. I want to start with Danny, and I want to start with thinking about what does it mean to wonder and to allow yourself to wonder. And that's where this book really does come from. It comes from a place of giving oneself permission to wonder in terms of asking questions, but also to be in awe, right? To be suspended in this moment of not understanding, of not quite being able to formulate, and pushing oneself to formulate something in a more capacious way. And so that wonder can be a really important modus operandi. It can be the force that leads you to work. And there, I guess I want to connect to Nomusa's comments as well about what does it mean to labor when one's labor has historically been devalued, right? And again, so for me, the engine of, I don't understand this, and yet I'm responding to it. I am moved by it. I'm moved to the point of discomfort or the point of confusion. And then to put in the work, the labor, to be able to explain to myself and then invite others into that explanation as well. That's another sort of dimension of why I write and why I write the way in which I do. And I was really, really struck by the juxtaposition, Nomusa, of what you were describing about sort of being alienated from one's work, and at the same time wanting to be able to have a kind of work that is a work of creating relationships. And the way in which you described what is the labor working alongside family members is something that I'm also trying to articulate, because for me, the labor that I'm talking about, and you're right, incognito, talking about the labor of love, I just tweaked that one tiny bit, which is to say the labor of care. That what does it mean to work, to care for one another? That should not be taken for granted at all. And that the ways in which we look at each other need to be defined by our capacity to put in that work, to care for, to care with, to care in relationship to. And that a Black gaze is my formulation of what does it mean to commit to doing that work when one is positioned both outside of the frame, right, and at the same time constitutive of the frame, right? And I've been talking to my students about what does that mean? What does a Black gaze mean in the context of a society or a moment when we are living in ways that are defined by that Blackness is constituted as negation, right? And recognizing that all around ourselves, but at the same time refusing to be defined by that negation. And that moment is really important, to recognize the moments of subjection, and to refuse to be defined by them at the same time. That is the kind of work I'm also talking about. That is the kind of work of discomfort and refusal. That is the kind of work that one of the other questions that you asked, Nomusa, is what are the fruits of that labor? And the fruits of that labor are relationships that can transform our current reality and shift us towards the possibility of living a different future now. So just to sort of recap, it's like, what if we start from a position of wonder that is disorienting, that is in awe, that we are trying to work through in order to get to another place? And what if that work were defined by labor of care that creates new relationships for how we encounter one another beyond the present circumstances that are seeking to constrain and confine us? For me, that is about a practice of looking. Or it begins with a practice of looking, or it begins by shifting the dynamics of looking and shifting the dynamics of subjection in looking or being looked at. And I think you're absolutely right, Danny. You get me. I get you. Which is to say that it is written as an invitation. And when we invite others into our spaces, others into a conversation, the possibilities of where we end up are magical, nothing less than magical.
Folks, please gather questions. I'm going to come your way, but I'm gonna maybe just take advantage of this seat and the mic for a second while folks gather thoughts. Going back, I think Nomusa raised this, and it's something that you really get into in the book, and I'm struck by, which is let me put it this way. Two things I think I want to come in on. One is this question of the tense that Danny pointed to, the as if, which I find so powerful, and I would love to hear you speak more about, because there's something that's been happening that I think you're picking up on, that in some ways is part of historical Black practice, but is also very new, is or different, there's a difference, is the living the future in the present, living the present as though the future has already happened, right? That the future liberation, future freedom, the ends of radical practice are here and now. And as I was reading that, I was actually taken to Dion Brand in a section of A Map to the Door of No Return, where she talks about tense and grammar and what words to use to describe that thing that happened. And there's a way in which I think what you do in the book from this vantage point, that's 2 decades on, is a kind of and filling the present with the future. And so I would love to hear more about that. The other question I have goes back to, or question comment, goes back to the term, the gaze, because there's a Danny used the terms both and you don't cede the difficulty of that term. You don't refuse it, but I think there's also a way in which what you seem to be pointing to, what I get from the book, is that a Black gaze allows us to hold these multiplicities, multiple privileges, ways of approaching what it means to be Black in this day and time from certain vantage points, and to engage across class, across understandings and experiences of gender, of sexuality, proximities to whiteness and proximities to Blackness. That there's something that gaze holds that another term might relinquish. So I just wondered if you could talk us through that word choice.
Sure. So there's two questions. The one is the question of grammar, and the other is a question of gaze. And the question of grammar is important to me. I've said this a few times, is that I spent 7 beautiful years of my life living in translation, living in another language and learning to think in that language. And so there's that on the one hand. But on the other hand, there is the history of Black feminism or Black feminist theory that teaches us that Black women have to learn how to conjugate ourselves, right? We have to we have to find our verb. We also have to find our noun, and we have to find a tense, right? A temporality that is meaningful, that can meaningfully represent who we are in the world. And that the structure of grammar has historically not included us. It has not given us the agency of the declarative sentence. I will, I can, I want to do, right? We have been systematically denied that particular form of conjugation, of doing, of saying what we are doing. And so to me, grammar is about claiming our space and time. It is also about claiming a particular form of agency that will not relinquish the now and will not defer the future to a time that we know we were never promised, and that people are systematically working to take away from us. So that's one of the deep investments I have in talking about these different tenses, these different grammatical tenses of writing and speaking myself into the world. And yes, and then the gaze, yes, there is this extraordinarily stubborn dimension of me that wants to have both and, that refuses the either or. And you're absolutely right, is that it is about when we connect the term gaze to the idea of Blackness or a Black gaze, it is impossible to think about that as a singular position, right? That Blackness is inhabited so differently in so many different places, and I wanted to be able to speak to that multiplicity, to speak into it and to speak from it. And the choice is also, you're right, because the gaze as a concept, right, both in terms of film and film theory and visual culture, but also in terms of psychoanalysis, has always been about, it's a term that describes a relationship, right? It describes a relationship between the screen and the spectator, between the narrative and the spectator, between the filmmaker or author, right, or operator and an audience. But it also describes the relationship of how a subject is formed, right, by being seen or by seeing themselves in relationship to another. And so my, what you describe as a kind of boldness or bravery in claiming that term is another refusal. I refuse to let it go. I refuse to let somebody tell me that I don't know what it means, that I cannot define it, and also that there is a kind of proprietariness over how I'm allowed to use that term. And I am sort of famously irritated by singular invocations of the gaze that go back to, somebody like Mr. Lacan, and tell me and want to tell me that this is the only way in which I'm allowed to use it or understand it. When in fact I did that. I went back to Lacan, and he doesn't say that a gaze is only a dominant thing. He does not say that. He says that the gaze is always relational, and that when we put ourselves into that relation, right, and if we refuse to allow it to be to marginalize us, then we get another possibility. We get another possibility of imagining something different. So yeah, I'm stubborn. I'm petulant. I'm a little selfish in wanting to have both. Because we've been denied so much. Why not insist on having more than we are offered? Always insist on more, because we are reclaiming something that that we are more than entitled to.
Did you? It is, so do we have? I love the insistence. And not only do I love it, as I was reading the book, I think appreciate, value, treasure are the verbs I would use for that, because I was reading and sort of thinking through, as you said, Tina, the book is broken into 7 verses. And just thinking about the way what you're doing. So there's a quote that you have, and I think I might be misrepresent it slightly, but it's from Arthur Jafa about bringing Black music, the lyrics of Black music into Black film and visuality. And I was thinking, as someone who loves words but also gets frustrated by words and wants to be, so much of thinking and theorizing from a space of Blackness is oft also, as you said, sort of thinking how to embody the grammar, how to embody the words with that which sometimes they're not meant to embody and to represent. It depends on the language we're talking about, but certainly from a kind of academic space, and often from, if we get into thinking through English in this sense, there are experiences that they're not necessarily meant to capture. And the idea of the book and what you're doing with the book as something that becomes a Black gaze is not necessarily an art book as such. It is, but what it's doing with a kind of genre mixing, maybe to what we've had from Zara, kind of selecting, right? A production of a mixed object that has still images, stills of video, of film and video, and words that produce sound. Like I found myself hearing the book. And did you have that experience?
It was just, I found that very funny because when Tina and I were having our conversation, I made the mistake of saying, when I was listening to the book, I was thinking. And, as you're talking, if I can just jump in here, there was something that I wanted to bring into the room. I was watching a lecture that Tina was giving at the Barnett Center, I think just as you became director there. And she began by sharing this anecdote where she's walking with a friend and trying to battle with the difficulty of words and articulation. And then turns around and says, I just don't want people to think I'm a naive optimist. And I found such immense resonance in that. And have somehow found myself coming to the phrase critical optimism as a way of expressing something that I think emanates within the Black tradition, within the Black feminist tradition, this way of reckoning with the tensions in life, but reckoning with the optimism, and I'm still thinking this through, but the optimism that must exist if we say we're committed to struggle. Because struggle is living on the conditions for the possibility of freedom. And in that way, I believe that if we are all in the struggle, on the left, within this tradition, we're all optimists. And why relinquish optimism to the realm of the naive, to the unthinking, to the hopeless? But why not, as a Black gaze does, reclaim and make space for critical optimism and the joy, the tension, the struggle, the precarity that it all contains?
Can I jump in there as well? Because I was thinking about our conversation as well, Danny, and where one of the things that I said that I've been teaching my students, and they've been talking about Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism as kind of a juxtaposition. And I said, I actually think of myself, in the words of my friend Fabio Nwango, as an Afro-vitalist, and that the idea of Afro-vitalism might be important because it is not futuristic, but it's about energizing, vitalizing, revitalizing Blackness in a way that allows us to inhabit it differently, and is in a way that also invigorates and enlivens us. So that the critical and radical optimism that you're talking about, we need the resources. I mean, I think that we have to be realistic as well, is that, where do we find the resources to do the kind of work that I'm asking or inviting people to do in this book? And we have to create our own resources. We have to revitalize ourselves. And that is a radical practice of care as well, extending that radical care to others so that, particularly in this moment in time, so that we can not just survive, but thrive. Because that's the other thing that I've told people, is that people have quoted me back to me talking about the future real conditional as the future we will have had to, right? That we will have had to. The future we want to live now. And there's a second phrase to that often gets missed, which is the future we want to live now in order to thrive, in order to allow ourselves to thrive. And that thriving is really what we're talking about.
So I just want to pull in folks from the live stream, from Zuko, just in awe right now, recalling the conversation Audre Lorde has with Adrienne Rich about grammar and thinking her journey with writing prose and what poetry did for her. From James in the live stream, we always begin with honoring the ground of the indigenous people to decolonize place. What is Johannesburg in this way? What are the ancestral names? I mean, Zara, did you want to?
I'm preparing my personal response.
Oh, okay. I wanted to actually bring you in terms of what we heard, and just, I think some people were moving, eyes were closed, some people were, bobbing heads, humming. If you could talk us through your practice of pulling the sounds together as a response to, or in conversation with, in relation to a Black gaze, because if we can say that, we listened to the book, we heard the book, then surely, our vinyl selector heard the book, and that was, I was hearing multiple temporalities, multiple spaces being convened and gathered. So if you could talk to us about just your process and how the book brought you to that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I think a recurring thing in Tina's work, and I guess in my kind of emerging practice, working with sound in this way, is around, I guess, like polyvocality, right? Which I think is, as folks with the histories that we have, right? I think polyvocality and polyrhythm has been this thing that we've always kind of embodied. And I think Tina's book really accesses that, not just through her insistence on acknowledging the frequency within I don't know where to look, at Tina, at you, at the audience. I'm kind of just a little bit overwhelmed. But not just the insistence that we must acknowledge the frequency within the work of these incredible Black artists that she speaks with, but also in her ability to look in multiple ways at one single kind of artistic experience. I kind of reject the idea that an artwork, there's very many things here. I think on the one hand, like as artists, you kind of have to relinquish any kind of control to like how the work is kind of received, and that again adds to the polyvocality, right? Because you put the work out there and it's like this ultimate offering in many ways, and you kind of have to be okay with whatever people want to project onto it, receive, and that I think brings in this idea of labor that you speak to, and that I'm also really interested in the process is how do I get folks to listen, which is actually really hard. I think it's laborious to sit and listen to something that doesn't really quite have a single melody. Not everything is going on the same type of time signature, like at all. But again, polyrhythm, polyvocality, and insisting that this is how we relate to the world, and this is how I personally think we need to, going back to Tina's insistence on, I guess, Afro-vitalism, there's a kind of slippage in between these various things for me that allows me to feel revitalize. The word that I use is enraptured. There's a kind of rapture that allows me to kind of go, okay, now I can continue fighting and continue being like treated in the ways in which I think as folks who are racialized and gendered in these ways are treated. And so it's really working with these different archives and allowing them to speak to one another through the sonic, which is the same process that I think like Tina's book kind of presents, is allowing these works to speak to one another in a really exciting way, for me at least. I feel really seen by your work, Tina. Thank you so much.
I do want to say that Zara, we've only met, have we met once in person or have we met twice in person? It's like maybe once in person. And we have been collaborating for like the last 2 years in different ways and in conversation. And I'm so grateful for that one time meeting you to be able to produce so much in conversation. But the other thing about what I appreciate so much about what you were doing with sound is that you're giving sound these multiple layers. You call it polyvocality, but the multiplicity of the layers happening all at once, the simultaneity of feeling that you're able to evoke through the layers of different kinds of sound, right? And that the sophistication of embracing sound as something beyond music, right? That you're able to do this thing, which is you're able to allow us to move through the sound, right? And to move with the sound. And sometimes it overcomes us and sometimes we have to respond to it. And that you're able to do something that to me is really about listening to images, which is you force us to make physical contact with the sound, and to put our arms around it and to swim with it. And that's something that I'm actually trying to do when I'm writing about images, is that I'm trying to ask you to put your arms around something that is unwieldy, that is, wriggling around, that you sometimes want to push away, and swim with it. And in that swimming, come to a different place. And swimming is not, again, you're going up against currents, right? It's treacherous sometimes. But what you do with sound is what I try to do with images, actually.
Yeah, just really quickly. I just want to relate to that and to a little bit of what we're trying to speak to this. I'm thinking about the kinds of labor that you're speaking to, Zara, as an artist, and the kinds of labor that Nomusa grounded us in and invited us to think about. And I want to talk about that discomfort, because it's been sitting with me for such a long time, that idea of how do we truly reckon with the discomfort of encountering art that moves in us in these kinds of ways. And in my work as a culture editor, I'm always thinking about ways of experiencing, ways of witnessing, ways of seeing, ways of writing about on the basis of that. And I think that you take us in this interesting direction, Tina, where you bring us back to positioning. And there was something that you said in our conversation where that I want to share, where you speak about the Arthur Jafa image, Crystal and Nick Siegfried on the cover. And what Tina had said was that it was very intentional, that this cover was this very particular mat that created a depth, that kind of functioned that the cover watched you no matter where you were in relation to it. And Tina said, depending on how you're looking at it, she sort of moves in and out of shadow, and you can and cannot see her in certain perspectives. So a black gaze is a gaze that positions us in relation to blackness. It is not static, it is mobile. We need to be able to position ourselves and understand what that positioning means And Tina said, that includes me. And I suppose the kind of invitation, provocation that I want to invite us to think about is, how do we then, because this is kind of what I'm asking myself, based on this book, reckon with discomfort and how that discomfort reflects back to us and asks us to think about our own positioning. So when we encounter art that challenges us, it's not simply, I don't like it, it makes me uncomfortable, or a kind of reactive response, but that we can have that response, but at the same time interrogate, what is it about my positioning in relation to it that is causing this kind of encounter, which is definitely something that I'm thinking through, like, for my own practice of witnessing work.
Tina, we have, I want to add on to this a question from the live stream, and then there's a question from our in-person audience. So Zenobia asks, how is the Black gaze associated with a visionary reading? What is in the gaze? Which I think in some ways links up with what Danny has put forth. And then we have a question from the audience. We have two.
Oh, okay, I didn't know if I should speak yet. First, I want to just share a lot of gratitude for all of the conversation and things shared from folks today. I really resonated with a lot of that. I have a question particularly about the sound work that you did. And when listening to your work and thinking about the pieces of art and the way that the Black gaze moves through the work that we were hearing from the book, and then the questions about, what does it mean to be committed to struggle? What does it mean to dance as a form of labor that's joyful? I was thinking about the elements of sound in your work. So I think I certainly heard many elements of a variety of Black musical tradition across the continent and the diaspora, both elements that felt oriented around struggle, resistance, as well as joyfulness. And then there was something that stood out to me that I wanted to ask about. So I was curious about the usage of the flute in this sound. There were moments where I was hearing a flute that sounded, I suppose, like a more Western classical flute, and I was thinking about like Lizzo and her usage of the flute in a way that's sort of a disruptor and joyful. But then there were also moments where the flute sounded to me very much like banturi, in both North and South Indian classical wooden flute. And we were talking about faith and struggle, and for me, the associations that I have with that flute is very much one of faith, with music of faith. So I was just really curious, particularly like for myself as a South Asian person studying solidarity in struggle, I was really curious about the usage of the flute, and if you might want to talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. I also just really appreciate that you're listening with so much attention and detail. Like that's best case scenario for me. So thank you. Okay, I see you, babes. But so the way, there's only so much one can really do with 15 minutes, right? And I guess which is why it was kind of offering and do with it what you will. And you really did with it what you wanted to do with it. But the flute is actually from Indiko Xaba, and the natives, who are a spiritual jazz outfit from South Africa. And I think why I'm really drawn to the song is called Flight, which is, I think, a lot of what we're all kind of engaged in, is like this practice of flight, or what one might term like marronage, right? And I guess there's something in the flute specifically that like evokes this feeling of flying and transcending, which is really what a lot of my practice is about, is like these moments of transcendence or ecstasy, again, rapture, that aren't necessarily enjoyable all the time, you know? Like sometimes when one becomes enraptured, it's a really painful experience, at least for myself. And sometimes it's really joyful, and sometimes it's a bit of both, and you're crying, you're like, are these happy tears or sad tears or angry tears? You don't really know what's going on. And so I think the reason I really love Ndikukaba's work is because it speaks to all those complexities of feeling and doesn't try to isolate them in any type of way, right? And then again, you know, speaking to your, you know, referencing South Asian spiritual music, I don't think a lot of these traditions exist outside of one another. I think they are constantly in conversation with one another. I think there's a reason why a lot of these musical traditions were banned in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in South Africa, on the plantations of Zimbabwe, on the plantations of the US and the Caribbean, you know, because they're all tapping in, for myself, all tapping into this transcendent possibility, and the insistence, I guess, to bring it back to what you were saying, that the insistence on living freedom now, even if it is yet really to come. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Thank you so much.
So Tina, I can see that you want to respond, but I'm wondering if we should take the second question from the audience, and then there's one more from the live stream, and then we can you can respond, other folks can comment as wrap up, and then I would hand back over to you both to wrap and to introduce the screening.
Okay, thank you so much, Tina, for such beautiful work, such meaningful work, and also to the panel. I think my question, which is also a comment, really speaks to what this concept around labor of love, like you said, Nomusa, and this labor of care. And I'm thinking particularly around the daily life. So like you said, Nomusa, the work that is meaningful when you're engaging with family, when you are working and dancing, right? And I'm thinking about the kind of conceptualizations that are inherent in our own languages in Africa, for example. So like when you think of, it's an article I read recently, actually, when you think of the difference between tiro and mereko, right? Like one being work that is done for a capitalist system, and another being work that is done as part of a communal endeavor that actually builds you. So I think that is a lot of what Tina is speaking to, you know, in this work that is written. But also it says something about the way that we as a people begin to conceptualize and really think about the work that is done in our daily experiences and distinguishing and making space for ourselves that is meaningful. So I guess, yeah, there's a question in the comments somewhere in there. Can't quite distinguish.
And they're both gorgeous. They're both gorgeous. I want to hand back to Victoria, and because you said there's another question, and I would ask you to could you read both of the questions? There was the one that you read before, and then this one, so that I can just wrap my head around those.
So that was from Zenobia. We had, how is the Black gaze associated with a visionary reading? What is in the gaze? And a follow-up from Zuko, Nomusa's redemptive process, still inhabiting, affected by Julius's sound offering, the loophole of retreat, that sounding at the prison. How does immersing as an act of encounter to see care?
I'm taking notes. Okay, so I really appreciate the comment about how within our own respective languages we as communities, as cultures, are trying to articulate the different valences of labor, of everyday labor, that there is a way in which we as communities are struggling to make care something that is not extractive, right? So the difference between caring as depletion, right? I'm working to give you something that in turn takes something away from me or diminishes me in some way, right? That we are trying to actually shift, or I would like to shift to a place where the exertion, the labor, is actually invigorating me. It is about a contribution that will get us to another place through which we can thrive. So I love your invoking those subtleties that are already there, right? That we need to mobilize conceptually. The question about how is the gaze associated with visionary readings and what's in it? Again, for me, the gaze doesn't have a content. For me, the gaze, or a Black gaze, is about a structure of viewing that enables certain forms of possibility, so that when we are in contact with a Black gaze, it is not about what we are seeing, it is about how we are seeing. So that it's just that that nuance of what is in it, or as opposed to how are we deploying, practicing, embracing it? What is it forcing us to do? What is it requiring us to do? So again, to make it into something that is an active perspective, an act of witnessing, as opposed to seeing something, right? And then finally, the last question that was posed from the live stream about immersion. I absolutely agree that that immersion activates us. And again, that it goes to the question of sound, because sound, unlike vision necessarily, sound makes physical contact with us, right? Sound is an active encounter with vibration and with frequency. So we need to be able to, in order to work with that, right, we need to open ourselves up to that contact. The premiere of my dog, always, at some point during my conversations. Oh, bye. She likes to tell me when to wrap up. So I'm going a little too far. I'm going to mute myself now, and then we can transition to the next part.
Thank you. I wanted to just, do folks want to have final comments?
I guess, yes. I think, a lot of really interesting comments or at least ideas around, and I think the point you made around positionality is so important, because the Black experience, and particularly the Black gaze, is a spatial thing, right? And Tina, when you were saying it's about a relationship, there's the older concept that we struggling with whether we push it away or it's a captive one, right? But it keeps that the person who's on the other side in one place, the person who's looking in one place. But of course, we know that the Black experience is about being uprooted, being displaced, being dispossessed, not being able to claim place. And I think you put your finger on the pulse when you were saying it's like making room, making space, right? And sound is like finding that making of spaces. So I mean, I think the thing that's really now capturing me about it is the possibility of translocation, the flight, right? Possibility of understanding that sort of spatial experience of it, and the possibility that allows us, in terms of sort of disengaging what is otherwise a very confining, engagement with images. So, yeah, I guess with that, and then also I'm so glad that you brought up the question around languages, because once we begin to delve into that, the meanings that emerge in terms of what ukusebenza is, are just so beautiful, because I'm reminded, in fact, again, I'm not laying claim to this because it's something that one of the students that I work with said a few days ago, and it's sort of what she's working on, was that she's working with the concept of umsebenzi, and umsebenzi is actually communing with your ancestors too, and it's like you're doing that to thank them. So the work is actually a practice of gratitude, more than it is, giving, investing so much of yourself, and it's actually about building. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. But yeah, it's the last sort of wrapping up statements. Thank you.
I guess what I'm starting to think about and to think through with your words, Nomusa, and what you've brought into the room and what we've all then riffed on, I keep thinking about Tina's reading and the image of those three sculptures in relation to each other, as I'm thinking about this idea of labor of care. And I suppose one of the gifts of the book is this ability to hold multiplicity of meaning. And one of the greatest gifts I was given was starting to think about the concept of care. James MacDonald and Gabrielle Goliath introduced me to Renee Messiah's work and the concept of curatorial care. And I guess I'm thinking about a Black feminist ethic of care, and this idea of the labor of care not taking us into the kind of heteropatriarchal demand of care within a masculine-feminine dichotomy, and care that is extractive labor that exhausts, but thinking about how Tina brought us towards the idea of vitalizing care, how those sculptures take us towards that idea of vitalizing care, how care can be an invitation, a collective, restorative, sometimes even difficult to do, sometimes take us away from the understandings of care as soft and gentle, sometimes firm. And I guess I'm starting to conceptualize and think about that within the invitation that you brought into the room with that idea. And I think that's also what a Black gaze as positionality requires us to do, to act from that position of care.
I don't really have like a closing statement, but more just an expression of like deep gratitude to kind of be in conversation with these like incredible women. And so, yeah, thank you so much to like the Center of Race and the class, and I think the curatorial care, and even just putting this together in a way that was really mindful of the ways in which, I mean, like you and I had never met before this, but there's so much resonance, and that I think is really rare, actually, because sometimes these events become like ticking, a checklist of like an institute's to-do list of, oh, okay, we've engaged with the public, let's keep it moving, but there's intention behind this that I think I'm feeling really grateful for. So I just wanted to shout out.
I just want to say, and then I'm going to hand over to Tina so that we can do the screenings. I have the beautiful, wonderful blessing of being able to say thank you to everyone in the room for coming, everyone it's not in the Zoom, I've gotten used to saying in the Zoom, in the live stream, to the good people, production folks, to the Forge, the Commune, Nomusa, Danny, Zara, and of course to Tina. I'm going to come back to Tina because I realize I missed James on the way. This is really, as I said before, I think it's the first of many, and with purpose, with intent, for work, for study, for play, pleasurable play, but also intense, dedicated, deliberate play and attention to what it is we're doing and where we're doing it from. One of the questions that came up, or comments in the live stream, was about what it means to do this from Johannesburg. And I almost want to say a thank you for that question, but to signal that this is something we have been thinking through, thinking with, and will continue to, which is the question of location, place, geography. It's something that comes up in the book that we haven't necessarily delved into, but the idea of flight in terms of moving through space, how we move through space and time, how we move through geography in relation to our different comings into the question of and the experience of Blackness. So thanks to everyone for being here and doing this, and to Tina for giving us this book as a phenomenal occasion to convene, to gather, and to engage. So thank you, Tina. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to hand over to you.
So thanks right back to you for creating a space to have an honest, intentional, serious conversation. And thank you to the wizard behind the scenes, which is James McDonald as well. Thank you for bringing people together as you always do. Thank you to the folks at the Forge. Thank you to RGC. I also need to thank the folks at Devalued, who launched us in a lot of ways on the path of the Sojourner project. And I am so grateful for that launch. And I'm so profoundly appreciative of where we have come. So in wrapping up, I'm going to introduce the films that we're about to see. And in a lot of ways, they bring us full circle, which is that when we embarked upon the idea of the Sojourner project, we had every intention of being there in person to have an exchange that was really about dialogue on the ground. And we launched the Digital Sojourner project thinking it was going to be something very, very small, and it turned out not to be. It turned out to be something the exact opposite, something that reached all over the place, and I'm delighted by that. But in the original iteration, we had planned to screen these two films as one of a series of others. And so I am really, really happy to be able to screen Untitled MASH by Simone Leigh, which is the film that I spoke about in the reading, as well as Crystal and Nick Siegfried by Arthur Jafa. I have to say that us screening it is just one small demonstration of their generosity as artists who would like to share their work. And I hope that you are able, in viewing it, to think about so many of the things that not just I was describing, but the gorgeous Black feminists who have been in conversation with me have also put into extraordinarily eloquent terms about what it means to inhabit a Black gaze and to partake of the work of withstanding a Black gaze when it is placed upon us as well. So I believe that the way in which this is going to work is that the first film that will screen is Untitled MASH. And then for those of you and that will be screened both for those of you on live stream as well as those of you who are in person. And then immediately after that, those on the live stream will be sent to a place on the RTC website where they can screen Crystal and Nick Siegfried. Unfortunately, due to YouTube's policing, we're not able to screen that live at the same time, but you can access it. There will be a indication of where to go to screen that film, and that I think will be available for 24 hours, maybe slightly longer. But I hope that you enjoy it, and thank you all for gathering, and it has been a pleasure to spend time with you.